Hi, and welcome back to another episode of TubaPeopleTV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here to introduce to you the next episode, which is actually a podcast that was done by the purveyor of the Horn Notes podcast, John Q. Ericson, professor of horn at Arizona State University. In May, Puddles and I were at Arizona State University in Tempe for the International Women's Brass Conference, and Professor Ericson invited us to come in and talk about Mr. Jacobs. So the following is that podcast. Please enjoy.
Hello, welcome to episode 37 of the Horn Notes podcast. I'm John Ericson, your host, the horn professor at Arizona State University. And our guest today is Mike Grose. And we're going to be talking about a big topic. It has to do with silos in brass teaching and how different people did actually sort of break out and have pedagogy that made an impact across a broader range of players than just their instrument. So let's get started. So our guest today for the Horn Notes podcast is Michael Grose, who is professor of tuba euphonium at the University of Oregon. So welcome, Mike.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
So good to be here.
Yeah, so we go way back, actually, back to Brevard. We taught at Brevard at the same time. Now, Horn Matters and Horn Notes podcast fans may be wondering, like, wait a minute, you got another tuba player on the podcast again. Today we're actually going to talk about a topic of kind of a bigger picture topic, which is teachers who broke through and taught and made impact in a broader than just one brass instrument. There's tons and tons of teachers who've made a lot of impact on one instrument, but to actually successfully make some impact across a broader stream of players is like a rarity, and really probably a post-World War II phenomena as well. So there's a few that come to mind, one of them being somebody that you've studied a lot, which is Jacobs.
Right.
And before we get to Jacobs, since the podcast has a lot of horn listeners, I'll start with somebody who I think as horn players we all love, and I think he tried to break through, but I don't think he quite succeeded, which was Farkas. So if you look at his arc of publications, the first one is The Art of French Horn Playing. Then you have The Art of Brass Playing. And then he goes even bigger with The Art of Musicianship. Yeah. Which is a book for everyone. Because who doesn't want to be a musician, right?
That's right.
But the book itself, The Art of Musicianship, is a great book, really worth reading, but it reads as a horn book, pretty much, because most of the musical examples are like horn excerpts, Galilei etudes, stuff like that. So it ends up being kind of a horn book. And I don't know how widely The Art of Brass Playing is referenced today, just because it's sort of dated, and I don't know.
It is. I'll have to say, though, I think it's that book. It was in that book that I first actually learned the word deportment.
Deportment?
Yes.
Huh.
And so that was an eye-opener, just how you carry yourself and just your behavior with your colleagues and that sort of thing.
Well, in that book, too, it has, the embouchure pictures. Jacobs is in there.
Yep, that's right.
Kleinhammer.
Right.
Some real greats are in the pictures there.
Herseth's in there.
Yeah. So he tried, and had some at least moderate success in reaching a broader audience, but I think he basically ends up reading as a horn player and horn pedagogue. Mm-hmm. Now, you've looked, obviously, a lot at Jacobs, and Jacobs impacted a lot of people.
Right. He had definitely had a global influence.
Every kind of brass instrument, for sure, if not, further.
Right. So
how did that come to be? He started off as a teacher. He must have initially just taught low brass.
Yeah, he started out. His students were pretty much trombones, tubas. Yeah, for sure. In the 30s and 40s, and then he started to become more well known for producing really good results, and so you actually had some high brass players coming to study with him locally in Chicago as well. And for instance, Vincent Chikowitz studied with Jacobs. Will Scarlett, who later joined the Chicago Symphony, studied with Jacobs. They were both trumpet players. So he had, toward the last 20, 30 years of his career, he was teaching all the brass instruments, as well as pretty much all the woodwind instruments, and some singers. And he'd actually have some very, very high-level singers come. People who were singing in the Met or in some European opera companies would come to him. Not a ton, but some. And he could help them because he knew them as people. To me, one of the main things that made Jacobs very popular, successful, I should say, which then of course made him popular as a teacher, was the fact that he knew people from his studies. And so what had been a lesson before Jacobs came along, the lessons were do as I say because this is what works for me. With Jacobs and his studies, his intimate knowledge of structure and function and psychology and respiration and anatomy and that sort of thing, a lesson with Jacobs was do as I say because this is what works for people. And so it was a very, people are everybody. That includes everybody.
Yeah. So it's another part of probably, you can elaborate on this more. One thing that, an observation you can easily make is some people who are great players don't even really know what they're doing. And if you've got problems, they're just it's a mystery to them.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the geniuses of Farkas. He just had some good problem-solving skills, and he had an interest in people, and that's part of what makes a good teacher. So he had enough knowledge to know that you're not trying to make everybody look like you, like mini-me's. It's like figuring out what's the problems with this production, what things are holding you up. Yeah,
I'd say so. And I think related to that, related to the mini-me, not going down the mini-me path that Jacobs did, was he really met the student where they were as an individual. He queried them, he talked with them. His first few minutes with that first lesson with the student was more for him than for the student. He was really assessing you, triaging you to figure out where you lived in terms of how you thought, how you communicated, what your interests were, so that he could go in the lesson with that information and then find ways to motivate you really well and get success for you. It's funny with Farkas. Farkas tells the story. He told the story at the International Brass Congress 2 in 1984 about how Jacobs, he never had a formal lesson with Jacobs, but there seemed like there would be this regular slump that Farkas would have in the CSO, and he'd go to Jake and say, "What am I doing wrong, Arnie?" And Jacobs would say, "Phil, just buzz your lips and blow the damn thing." Something like that. In other words, don't worry about it. Just play. Because Jacobs knew that all the information that Farkas needed to play well was already in his mind. The brain works on percentages, and so Farkas had a very high level of playing, and so all the necessary information in his mind and his body was already there. And so if he could just get out of the way, he'd be fine. So these were some of the things that Jacobs really brought, and it made him successful as a teacher for people, and then made him successful, in particular on a wide scale, global basis. Was his knowledge of people and psychology, and he was not at all. He didn't know any of this stuff when he was 20 or 25 or 30. He says he basically had maxed out his playing by the time he's 20 or 25, and his information as that he used in the studio came later. So it wasn't something that he was messing with while he was learning to play. He would just copy his mom and copy other people he heard. His mom was a pianist and stuff. So.
Well, now turning more into his pedagogy more directly, the only contact I've had myself really is all secondhand, and the most direct, in terms of my own lessons, was with Becky Root, who, and I think back to this, I still refer to this in my teaching very often, the time with Becky Root, because I took a lesson with her, and she started talking about breathing, and none of my teachers had ever talked about breathing to me before then. And partially it's because I'm like 6 foot tall, and you can sort of breathe okay, and if you're tallish, and you can do it.
Well, yeah, you have a pretty long torso. Yeah, I'm sure the listeners can tell that. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
yeah, it's pretty much on display.
Thanks.
It's quite the torso.
But Becky really talked to me about breathing. She had a couple very concise things that she said were Jacob's exercises that she had used with him, and they were super helpful. And I refer to those a lot in my teaching, actually, because it really comes up a lot in horn. And I think that's, well, it doesn't. It comes up half the time in horn. Like if somebody's fairly tall, they can get away with breathing kind of okay. Mm-hmm. But if they're shorter stature, they need to breathe well.
This is correct.
And that's something that Jacobs would have had enough insight into to definitely impact some horn players right in that time frame that he was teaching.
Yeah, for sure. One of his research projects, I mean, he actually did do research projects that weren't, I don't know that they were published. I think they're lost to the harshness of the unclimate-controlled storage unit in Florida. After he passed away, his son took a lot of his materials, and they became destroyed. But he did do some research projects. One of them was determining an accurate assessment of your vital capacity, your lung capacity, based upon your height, your gender, and your age. And your somatotype. So the
What's that?
Body shape.
Body shape.
So your the medical books would make a prediction based upon height, age, and gender. But what really alerted to the medical books being not fully accurate was when Will Scarlett walked into his studio. Will Scarlett's like 5'6", 5'7", and the books said that he should have like maybe 3 liters of air, 3.5 liters of air. He had like 6.5 liters of air. And Jacobs tested his lung capacity a couple of times, and then just at the end he just said, "Look, you're a freak," But he didn't know why, and so he realized that it was somatotype was part of it, body shape. So that's when he started to keep that fourth factor. And so when a student would come in, he could more or less look at the student and guess pretty accurately how much air they would have. So this is the kind of thing that he was attentive to in his teaching, and certainly somebody who is shorter, male or female, you really do, with not as much air. Not if you're not like Will Scarlett, who had this amazing amount of air capacity because his torso was so long. If you didn't have that kind of air, then you need to really use your full bow. Whereas somebody who's maybe 6'2" or something like that, and they have 6 liters, 7 liters of air, maybe they play trumpet, or maybe horn
or oboe,
or oboe, then they could really get away with not breathing much.
I mean, they're just worrying about stale air at some point more than anything else.
So but in time that could create problems as with the aging process, because the aging process physiologically does change things. So I remember him in a lesson, one particular lesson, explaining the aging process to me and encouraging me to be a good breather. And if I was a good breather, then I would age gracefully as a brass player.
Well, here's like a story related to that. So I got hired here at ASU in 2001.
I remember.
And some reason or other, Sam Pilafian just saw something, and he kind of pulled me aside and said, "We got to work on your breathing here." And I had begun to notice, like, Gliere Concerto, there were phrases, there was like, these are getting harder, So, so kind of pulled me aside, and we did some breathing gym type stuff, and I got focused on that a little more. It's like, there's just he described it as breaking down the lacquer in your lungs. I don't know if it really is lacquer in your lungs, but in any case, it's just like kind of focusing on using it better, because you lose elasticity with age.
You do, yes, absolutely. With age, you become less elastic, and so you just have to. If you set yourself up when you're young for great breathing, and you just keep those habits going, then you're going to be great. But if you don't, then it's going to be difficult. Or if you get distracted as you get older and you start to go down the path of less breathing, then that'll be a problem too.
Breaking in for just a second to the podcast, we had a slight break when we were recording, and when we weren't recording, we mentioned Sam Pilafian, which brings us back into the podcast. So we just mentioned Sam. So I'd like to turn a corner a little bit on just the whole topic of, again, back the original premise was talking about people who sort of broke through multiple instruments in their pedagogy. Sam would be one, I think, although partially through the drum corps side of working with things, but then it became bands and it became all the brass to some extent.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Sam could make anybody sound better. He did not necessarily have the global influence on all the instruments like we're talking about with Jacobs, but no question. I had him up. You'll probably remember this because this happened after you started here at ASU, John. I had him up at Oregon, wrote a proposal for him to be a visiting professor for a couple of weeks up at Oregon, University of Oregon, in like 2000 something. And he came up, and I put him in front of, I put students of all types with him, all wind instruments, chamber music, whatever, jazz, of course.
Oh yeah,
everything, and he was great.
Coach anything.
He was great with everybody. He got something. He gave something to everybody that they all appreciated. It was amazing. He was just he was a teacher's teacher and a student's student. I mean, he studied teaching, and as a student, he absolutely was a sponge throughout his life, for sure. It's no question. It was amazing to watch him work. And he came to Brevard when we were Brevard. Yeah. And came a couple summers, and he was just so generous with his teaching, so relatable, and wonderful information, and made people feel at ease, and would then sneak in the good stuff.
Yeah, no, he had a million stories, and he knew right when to drop them and stuff. He was great. Now, just mentioning a couple other names that I wanted to mention at least. I don't think either of us are super familiar with their teaching. One of them would be Caruso. Mm-hmm. And I've studied a number of people sort of secondhand Caruso, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. The thing that I figured out about him, which relates to what you were saying about Jacobs, so he wrote a book, it's called Musical Calisthenics for Brass, which is still in print. And the book itself, if you get a hold of it, it's unstructured. Like, you would not be able to figure out how he actually used this book by the way it's printed. And you would have to actually study with a Caruso practitioner, so to speak, to actually know how to do it. And if you were taking lessons with him, everything was taught prescriptively. Mm-hmm. He would design a little routine, a little prescription for what your problems were. And I think he was from what I can tell, he must have been a very warm individual who was very intuitive in working with people, and just had a good vibe working with people. It sounds like Jacobs had much that same kind of
for thing. Sure. There's no what I call the dirty little secret about the Jacobs method is that there is no Jacobs method. It was strictly he would construct a curriculum for the student who was in the room with him at that time, and he would use various books. There was no Jacobs method book. So what Caruso published, it's sort of these random studies that there doesn't seem to be any systematic or methodological order to them from what you're telling me.
Yeah, you don't start at the beginning of the book and just go.
Right.
You will definitely hurt yourself if you do that.
Right. So yeah, Jacobs was very much like that. He was very much the teacher of the individual, really wanting to find ways into the individual's mind, the student's mind, to help motivate them properly. Motivation was key. Jacobs knew that motivation of the student, of the mind, was key to success. And he worked very hard to gain access into a student's mind to help take them on this trip to success, to music, to high art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, the other name that I came up with in my little list was Donald Reinhardt, who I think is sort of fallen off the map a little bit, as so many people talk about. Back when we were like students, I mean, the pivot system was pretty well known.
Right.
He wrote a whole book. Have you ever seen his book, The Encyclopedia of the Pivot System?
I've heard of that.
It's a very hefty book. I mean, it's like a good inch thick.
I don't have it.
Thing.
No.
And he talks in there about how he discovered this system after he had taken lessons with, I don't know, like 10 different teachers, none of whom helped him play better. Mm-hmm. And then he had this, he was a trombonist. Right. And he had his instrument worked on, then they left the weight on the back. And the instrument like tipped down further than normal. And suddenly he could play high notes that he had never played before. And that was like the eureka moment. That was like what created this system.
Right.
So, but it was definitely had its following back in the day. And definitely the trumpet and trombone, there was a lot of people following pivot system. I don't think not so much horn because it's like sort of more fixed, especially if you're playing on your leg. And I kind of suspect tuba the same.
Yeah, I'm not...
It wasn't as influential within the tuba.
Yeah,
world.
No, I don't think so. Maybe a little bit somewhere along the way. I don't remember in my own times with Jacobs. I don't remember him really talking about it. It's not to say that he wouldn't have necessarily talked about it with somebody if he thought that he could have helped him. That's the thing with Jacobs is everything was on the table, and pretty much his bottom line was just sound great. And whatever we have to do to sound great is fine. So if somebody came into the studio and was telling a great story through music, but doing it quote unquote all wrong, he'd just sit back and listen, and he'd have a great time. He might suggest some things or point some things out, but again, it comes to the is the student, if the student's perceiving themselves as doing well. Then maybe they're not going to be motivated really to take that information. And this is something that Manny Laureano talks about in his Tuba People TV interview.
Plugging Tuba People TV.
YouTube channel, Tuba People TV. Yeah, so Manny talks about how his first lesson with Jacobs, Jacobs mentioned some things, but they kind of Manny didn't really grasp them or understand them, or maybe didn't want to understand them at that time. Later, though, it became these things became bigger, more problematic, and Manny went back, and Jacobs was able to help him right away. But so I think motivation is so important. So if a student is not really ready to hear that or doesn't want to hear it, then it's going to be difficult to tell the student what you observe. But basically, the bottom line with Jacobs was, you want to be a communicator of a great message to your audience through music. Right.
So you've developed you mentioned, you dropped a little point about a YouTube channel.
I think I did it very tactfully and quite professionally, yes.
So when you're not like driving your car, like let's say hypothetically you're listening to this podcast while driving in your car.
Yeah.
Don't go to YouTube right now. But if you're at home or whatever later, so you just look for Tuba People. Is it Tuba People TV on YouTube?
Tuba People TV on YouTube. Yeah. Tuba People TV. Tuba People TV.
That's almost a tongue twister.
You can go to tubapeople.com and access Tuba People TV through the link at tubapeople.com.
That sounds complicated right there.
Well,
But cool. So, and you've done, round figures, how many interviews have you done?
I've done about 125 interviews. I think 115-ish are posted right now. Former Jacobs students from around the world. It's been a really fascinating project. I studied with Jacobs for 17 years, and I thought I knew him pretty well. I knew of the persona. But boy, I have learned so much more about this person, Arnold Jacobs, than I dreamed I could know. One of the funnier stories that it was not imaginable to me was with Mark Schubert, our colleague at Brevard, trumpet colleague at Brevard, and he's now down at Baylor University, trumpet
right.
chamber music professor. He had a lesson with Jacobs. And Jacobs had to get somewhere fast, and he lost track of time. And Jacobs noticed the time and said, "Oh my gosh, I have to go, and I don't know how I'm going to get there so fast." And Mark happened to ride his motorcycle to the lesson, and Mark said, "Well, I can take you through town a lot more quickly through the traffic of Chicago on the back of on my motorcycle."
It sounds a little too exciting for me.
Would you like to do that? And Jacobs said yes. And so I'm just this imagery of Arnold Jacobs on the back of a motorcycle with Mark Schubert, weaving in and out of traffic in Chicago to get to the other side of the loop I don't know, it's kind of funny. So I didn't know that about him.
Yeah. One of I won't name which teachers. One of my teacher I work with, I was told drove like a maniac. Like, you wouldn't have actually guessed this person drove like a maniac, but if you rode with him, he drove like a maniac. So you never know. so Jacobs had a need for speed apparently that day.
Well, yeah, he
was up for it.
He had to get.
But if it was me, I'd be like, I don't know
yeah.
about motorcycle.
But there's just it was really interesting just to hear the whole point of the Tuba People TV project with Jacob's students. Jacobs treated each person as an individual, and so he did construct, as I mentioned, an individualized curriculum for that student at that moment in time. And if he knew that they were going to be a long-term student, then it would be a longer arching, longer arch of curricula. Where he was headed with the student.
Like, what would that have been with a horn player, for example?
I don't know. I'm not a horn player.
Well, you talk to them on your thing. Right?
Exactly. You have to go to Two People TV. Apparently, you haven't been to watch those horn players.
I don't remember what they said. No, I was curious if he used standard materials or along the lines of Coprash, or did he have but he would have constructed this for each person.
He would have. I mean, I can tell you that for us tuba students, we had the blue book and the red book, the Potag books, both.
So you used I remember you showing me that. I'm just really? You used the big, because I look at the big blue book and I'm just kind of this book is not super usable for me.
No, yeah, there was a lot. He liked for tuba players, he liked to use, and he required us all to learn treble clef, C treble. And because he would say, the great music is found in the right hand, not in the left hand. So he would make us work.
Well, the world is in C. That's like a inside joke, actually, in relation to a Fern Reynolds lesson years ago. For the horn players, the world is in F. I just that's where I was.
So it translated well for the tuba in terms of range. It wasn't, if we weren't too high, if it was strictly the trumpet, and we weren't too low if it was strictly the trombone. Yeah. It was a good range for the tuba. But the Potag books, certainly Coprash. There's Arbin, of course. Some Bordonis. It was a long list of things. Phil Collins, who used to play principal trumpet in the Cincinnati Symphony, he's written a book or two in the singing style. That came out in the mid '80s, and Jacobs got a copy of it, and he just loved it. So we all got that. And it's just that book is just a collection of orchestral and operatic melodies that we play, and so that type of thing. But it would be individualized. It would be for that student, and it would be really just how to help that student solve the problem that Jacobs was going after at that point in time with that person.
Yeah. Well, going back to kind of aiming towards wrapping up, we had as the general topic was the silos of brass, and it's actually they're almost impenetrable between different instruments. It's so interesting that they these people broke through those.
Yeah.
How do you go about breaking that down? I don't know. What do you see as a? You
mean how to do it?
Yeah, I mean,
without Jacobs or post Jacobs,
just in the future of things. For example, right now we're at the International Women's Brass Conference. Mm-hmm. There's not actually that many all brass events when you get down to it. There's the tuba, euphonium.
There's not brass congresses there were a couple.
They're very rare,
right?
To have an all brass event that's actually reasonably sized.
Yeah.
Such as this.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things that will help is that there was a point in time I was working on, just for an example, I've got pretty interested in the MRI horn studies that have been done, and So I was giving a presentation about that, and a trumpet player was just kind of like, "Oh yeah, we knew all this stuff in trumpet like 20 years ago." Mm-hmm. And I was like, "Yeah, okay, but I don't know. It's like communication. I don't know. There's a lot of there's difficulties."
So there's let me try and get a couple things in here related to what you just said. So one of the things that made Jacobs so successful as a teacher, as I mentioned, is because he knew people. And one of the reasons he knew people is because he had intuited neural-plasticity back in a time when that was considered bad neuroscience, back in the 40s and 50s. He taught from a position of neural-plasticity, that the brain can change itself. And of course, that was considered bad science. And if you were to go to a neuroscience conference at that point in time in the 50s and talked about neuroplasticity, you would have been likely escorted out the doors. You fast forward to the mid 90s when we get these devices that can look inside the mind, the MRIs, fMRIs, CT scanners, these diagnostic pieces of equipment, and we find out, oh, you know what? The brain does change itself. There is neuroplasticity. So that was something that he was 40, 50 years ahead of where neuroscience was. And so that gave him the opportunity to really work with a student and get them to change their habits little by little, on the premise that the brain works on percentages, the underlying neuroplastic premise of percentages. That was pretty cool, and that was something that really made him so successful. So as far as moving post Jacobs, I think with this information, there's probably going to be somebody that's going to come along and gather all this information and be equally as adept and also as an amazing artist, and perhaps have the bully pulpit of the Chicago Symphony to attract so many students from around the world. I think in our current day, somebody that comes to mind that crosses those various lines is David Fedderly. Dave Fedderly was a longtime student of Mr. Jacobs, and retired now tubist of the Baltimore Symphony. But he's somebody who has helped a number of brass and wind players through his teaching. So it's not just tuba, but it's all manner, all type of wind and brass players. So.
Yeah, well, it's a great topic. That's for sure. It's like there's points in time we have to think big. And in my own case, I was thinking, because with the passing of Sam Pilafian, I was thinking how he was able to get far beyond sort of the tuba player silo.
No, he's about music. He was about music, and that again, that's something that Jacobs was about. He was all about the music. It wasn't, he's often regarded as the breathing guy, the breathing guru. It was not breathing. Breathing was he would, if he saw a student in his studio who was prejudicial against providing great artistry because of their breathing habits, then he would work with their breathing. That happened to be a lot of people, actually, a large segment of the population that had that issue, and then he would help them with that. But so he got this reputation as being the breathing guy. He was all about the music. All about the music. It was amazing how much about the music he was, and in comparison to how he's kind of not really as well known for that. He's more known for the breathing thing. And he had two lungs. He didn't have one lung. He had two lungs. My first lesson with him, I had heard that he had one lung, and so my first lesson with him in 1981, I said, "Is it true that you only have one lung?" And he laughed and said, "No, I just have I have reduced capacity, so it's like I only have one lung, but I have two lungs."
Aha.
Yeah, you heard it here.
You heard it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of myths out there, actually, in a lot of ways, about a lot of people.
Right. And, the whole Tuba People TV project, if I can just close that loop, he taught people as individuals. And so what I'm trying to do with this project is to interview as many of his former students as I can to get that person's piece of Jacob's pedagogical pie, their slice of his pedagogical pie. And there's Dee Stewart, who's recently retired from Indiana University as professor of trombone. He tells a really great story about how he started studying with Jacobs in the 50s, and his wife would come with him to lessons and take notes on 3x5 cards. And you get into the 60s and 70s, and people are saying, Mr. Jacobs, he's getting more popular. You should write a book. You should write a book. And I'm too busy. And so one lesson, Mr. and Mrs. Stewart came to Dee's lesson. And at the end, Mrs. Stewart handed Jacobs this fat stack of 3x5 cards that were notes on Dee Stewart's lessons. So, and she handed it to Mr. Jacobs, and she said, "Here's your book." And Jacobs said, "Oh no, that's Dee's book. That's about Dee. If I were to write that book, that would not apply to a lot of people." Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the reasons why I think he did not write a book, is because he was very individualized in his approach to people.
That's an important thing I think to grasp on too for any brass teacher out there. Is there's people who, how your teacher taught you,
right?
But that doesn't mean that you need to teach every student the same way that you were taught.
Right.
It's not really going to work. Mentioning Dee, so in my degree, my brass pedagogy degree at IU, actually I observed one of my projects was observing I think of 10 of his lessons, teaching. And he had some very interesting lessons, I will say, observing his. I mean, he may have knew that he was being observed. I don't know. And he taught, but it was very interesting.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see little windows into different teachers' pedagogy and stuff. And he had definitely, that was interesting.
No, it is. And doing this project, having talked to 125 or so former students of Jacobs, you teach as you were taught, as you mentioned.
At least you start
that way. So one of the things that was has been really influential in my own teaching, it has been to talk to these people, these former students, and realize that what Jacobs told me was not necessarily what he told them, some of them. So he had a different approach. He had a different approach, and that was very pondering. Lots of pondering for me to think about that. And so that just opened up the whole notion, and really of you approach this, you approach the student as an individual, not as a method. And that's been very helpful. I knew that intellectually about Jacobs before I started the project, but it really resonated loudly as I would interview these people. And realized that it was not necessarily the same experience that I had. It was a different experience.
Yeah, I think that probably is a good point to close on too, because I think that relates to this whole why he could break through, because he was teaching, again, using his problem-solving skills and his repertoire of knowledge, and he's using it individually with individual students, in relation to whatever came up. You can actually observe this if you go to master classes sometimes, because people will they'll have doesn't matter what the person does, they're going to talk about this topic because that's what they do in master classes. Or if they're really listening and they're really this is what I hear this person's problem is, and they hone in right on that through their repertoire of knowledge. Exactly. So I think that's what you have to really aspire to. Certainly, as teachers, you have to aspire to be, and certainly I do, and I'm sure you do.
Absolutely.
You try to. Everybody's individual. Sometimes students will ask me why is so and so working on this, and I'm not. And well, it's because you're not the, and also they've studied with other people before they got to me as well. So. Yeah. I'm not going to want to, if they already worked through all of Maxime Alphonse with somebody else, I'm not going to work on Maxime Alphonse with them. I'm going to find some other materials that have a different angle.
Yeah, I mean, Jacobs, there's any number of accounts on some of the Tuba People TV interviews where a student would come in and fully expecting to be working on breathing, because Jake's the breathing guy. And he wouldn't touch it. He wouldn't talk about it at all. And they go back for another lesson, fully expecting to work on breathing. He must have just missed it, and he wouldn't touch it. And they go back for a third lesson, and he wouldn't work on breathing. And towards the end of the lesson, they'd say, well, Mr. Jacobs, don't you want to work on my breathing? And he'd say, why? You breathe great.
Yeah.
So I have to say, John, it's so good to see you. John and I have been friends for a long time. I would not be at the University of Oregon were it not for John Q. Ericson.
Oh, I'm just a little cog in
No,
this process.
I didn't know. We both came out of the performance world. He was with the Nashville Symphony. I was with the Savannah Symphony, and you were a few years ahead of me in this transformation into the academy. And I was not well connected to listservs where job vacancies were posted. And John emailed me the listing for the University of Oregon position. And I would have never known had it not been for John Q. Erickson.
Well, there you go.
So as a token of my thanksgiving and gratitude to you, I'd like to give you this really wonderful Tuba People hat.
Oh, you could
All
hear
right.
it
Yeah.
on the video.
Yep. So
Wow.
please wear this hat in great health and
Sure.
keep your scalp from getting too burned.
Yeah, because anybody that's seen a picture of me knows that I'm like pretty much getting bald at this point.
Pretty much getting bald. Yeah, I think we're birds of a feather.
Denial about it. Well,
Yeah, maybe it's just a poco.
but like my wife, one of her big things is she's anti-comb over. So as soon as it was getting sort of short, sort of getting baldish, she's like, yeah, that's it, and it's like no comb over. So yeah, no, I will wear it with pride. I'm getting where what his point was. I wear caps a lot more than I used to, as I'm sure you probably do too.
Absolutely.
Compared to the past,
Yes.
because you get to that age.
Yeah,
So yeah,
my doctor says wear a cap.
especially in the summer, it'll be like a fun one to wear around. So thank you.
And it's beautiful ASU colors too. Not duck colors, go Ducks, but it's beautiful ASU colors.
Go maroon and gold.
There you go. By the way, circling back to the very beginning of this interview, you referenced Harvey Phillips. And I'm going to reference Harvey Phillips.
I'm not sure I referenced.
No,
Harvey
you
Phillips.
didn't, but you referenced IU, and we talked about tuba, having a tuba in this podcast series. You had Professor Swoboda recently, and now you have another tuba player, me, and how odd that is. But really, Harvey Phillips was longtime professor of tuba at Indiana University and professor emeritus, highly regarded in the business. And he actually said that the horn is the alto-tuba. So I think it's highly appropriate that Deanna and I have been on this podcast.
Yeah, well, I've got some alto tubas hanging around in the room here called tenor horns. But also, just as a completely random aside, so I used to run the brass methods classes. I don't run them anymore. Mm-hmm. But when I was running them, I had a tuba in the office here. And I would go in and play with the tuba class like once a week just to be, when they were doing tuba,
Right.
I would just check on them. The TAs actually ran the class, but I would go in and check on them
Sure.
every week.
You'd bless it.
So I would play tuba, and really, I think I sound pretty decent on tuba. My tonguing works pretty well. It was kind of interesting.
Well,
I could get into it, except for the fact that I'm like a full-time horn teacher. But maybe that's a retirement project. I'll work my way down.
Harvey Phillips would say you're a full-time alto tubist, so.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But I think the tonguing and stuff, a lot of it transfers between horn and tuba actually better than... Well, I'm sure there's way we talk about tonguing, but we don't tell it to like trumpet players and trombonists because, they think they know everything and the way they do it is different than the way we do it. That's another reason why there's silos in the horn in the brass world, but some of us have figured out more than people let on. I don't know.
It's great to see you, John.
Yeah, it's great to see you after these years. I've actually got a picture of you up on my wall over there.
I'm gonna have to look at that after we leave here. Yeah.
And kept it up with my souvenirs from Brevard.
Excellent.
So yeah.
Thanks for inviting me in.
Yeah. So again, people out there, check Tuba People TV. I bet you there's at least a dozen horn interviews on there if you want to just listen to horn, but there's more than horn on there as well.
Yeah, there's horn, trombone, tuba. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Trumpet.
Yeah.
Lots of trumpets. And that was actually one of my questions for trumpeters is, why did you're a trumpet player? Why did you go study with Jacob? So that was always an interesting conversation. Speaking of silos.
Yeah. Yes. All right. So again, safe travels. You're off to another conference here.
Yep.
And
going to another one.
And then off traveling the world, being
Tuba Mike.
World domination with Tuba Mike.
There you go.
So, all right. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we're back in the Horn Note Studios, closing out the episode. This is the longest episode we've posted, and actually right at the maximum length that I can post. So I hope you enjoy it. So to close, I just want to add a brief plug. We've just recently, with my Horn Notes edition publications, they were available only as Kindle ebooks for a while, and finally took the plunge, did some formatting, did a bit of work. It didn't take as long as I thought it might, and they are all now available as printed versions. Just go to Amazon.com. If you want to have a little fun, search for John Ericson, John Ericson. I'm not the only one there. So there's some religious books, there's some Western books, but most of the ones you're going to see are my books, and they're available in, as I said, Kindle and paperback. Topics ranging from mellophone to Wagner tuba to natural horn to descant triple horns and a lot of other stuff there. Thank you again for checking out the Horn Notes podcast.
Thanks again to John Ericson for having Puddles and I in to discuss Mr. Jacobs and his influence not only here in the United States but globally. We hope you enjoyed it, and now back to you.